Hello, everyone, and welcome to this edition of the Learning Curve podcast powered by KNOLSKAPE, where we try and decipher how organizations are building internal capabilities to position themselves for the future. My name is Dr. Ritvik Mishra. I'm the Chief Client Officer for KNOLSKAPE, and I'll be your host for today's edition. Now, today's episode is going to look deeper into this whole concept of leadership. Now, leadership is not easy. That's one of the reasons we see so much research happening on this topic, thought leadership coming out, books coming out, and of course, podcasts, right? Uh, in today's day and age, it's becoming even more complex. It's getting impacted by the ever evolving and changing landscape of technology. It's getting impacted by the geopolitical situation around the world. It's getting impacted by talent priorities. You've got multi-generational workforce at the workplace. You've got inclusion as a major focus and priority. It's getting impacted by business factors. Organizations are getting impacted by non-traditional competition. You have discerning customers. And so to decipher all of this and unravel all of this, we've got the perfect person on today's show. He has spent decades studying what makes great leaders tick. He's a barrister turned leadership expert. That's right, you heard it right. A barrister turned leadership expert. A partner at Heidrick and Struggles, host of the globally top ranked podcast, The Leadership Enigma. He's worked with leaders from Google, Microsoft, HSBC, Nike, and the International Criminal Court, and even all 43 UK police forces, delivering high impact experiential learning to over 100,000 professionals worldwide. From courtroom to boardroom, he has seen leadership at its best and at its lowest. Today, he joins us to discuss how leaders can futurize, personalize, and humanize their approach in the age of AI, rapid transformation, and rising uncertainty. Please join me in welcoming Adam Pacifico to this Learning Curve podcast. Adam, welcome to the edition.
Well, thank you very much indeed. I'm not sure I recognize that wonderful person that you've just described, and there's no pressure on me whatsoever in relation to solving some of those conundrums that you outlined.
I know, and I'm sure you've been in front of judges who've been a lot more, strict and tough. But this is going to be an easy cakewalk for you, Adam. But
Okay.
before we move into the set of questions that we have for you, we do have a rapid fire section to get us started with the podcast. So, are you ready for this?
I'm ready for this.
All right. The most underrated leadership trait.
Most underrated, probably vulnerability.
Vulnerable. Interesting. Absolutely. Completely agree with that. What's harder, being a barrister, a leadership consultant, or a podcast host?
What a great question. I think being a barrister was a tough gig. It was tough. And I was very young at the time, so doubly tough.
Yeah. If you could learn one skill overnight, what would it be?
Piano.
Okay. Interesting. If you could give one piece of advice to aspiring leaders, what would it be?
See it as it is, not worse. I think we're working in a world at the moment that is pretty chaotic, and it's very easy to catastrophize on things. So I always say to my team, let's see it as it is, not worse.
Yeah. Gratitude.
That too.
What's next for you in 2025, Adam?
Well, we're going great guns with the podcast. Thank you for mentioning that. And I think what we really want to do is to have as much impact to as many people over the shortest period of time. I think that's really the aspiration. That's
excellent. Thank you so much for joining us in that rapid fire section. We're going to move into
warm up. Did that work as a warm up?
That's the warm up.
It did the trick. Good.
Absolutely. And I wish I had a gift basket for you to give you. But next time we catch up where we meet, definitely a gift basket for you on the rapid fire section. But let's move on to the main section. I think our listeners are are going to be keen to understand how organizations and leaders are really trying to understand this chaotic situation in which the world is, and how do you discern that, and how do you move forward in that kind of a scenario.
Yeah.
So, Adam, you've got a very incredible, diverse career. Like we spoke, barrister, leadership consultant, host of a globally ranked podcast. And I'm sure you've gone through all of these phases, unlearning and learning, right? So how did you go through each of these pivotal points? What did you learn in each of these phases? And what was the biggest challenge as you were going through this phase of unlearning and relearning?
Right. I love the point about learning and unlearning, because I think years ago, the advice to some leaders was you had to change as the times would change. And then you would, in some ways, freeze again into whatever state you were in. And that's what was going to be appropriate for the next 5 years. We know now, don't we, that
Right.
things are changing so quickly, so chaotically, so seismically,
Mhm.
that leaders have got to be in a constant state of learning all the time.
Mhm.
So my career is strange. Let's be honest. It's you were kind in the way you described it. I would describe it as slightly strange. That's always how my mother described it. You missed a bit out actually, because not only was I a barrister
Right.
prosecuting and defending in the criminal courts, after about 4 years of that, I turned to become a police officer. Yep, on the streets of London for 6 years, 4 years on the covert teams, spending time with the robbery, gang, and narcotics units. None of this makes sense already, does it? But that was very interesting, to go from defending and prosecuting in the criminal courts to then being
Right.
an operational officer on the mean streets of London sometime in the 1990s.
Yeah.
So to your point, I had an opportunity as a barrister to really see the full gambit of emotions that would play out in people's lives,
Right.
because these were high stakes situations.
Yep.
And whether I was dealing with family cases or criminal cases at a young age, I had to really get used to dealing with quite intense emotions, not only my own, but obviously of my clients and all the parties around me. I think when I went into the police, I think I then saw behaviors play
Right.
out. And I had to try and understand I was seeing the very best of human behavior. And you alluded to this, also the very worst of
Right.
human behavior. And sometimes you see things that you can't unsee, and you have to rationalize that
Right.
in your own mind. When I went into the leadership development space, I think that's when I started to focus a little more on mindsets,
Mm.
because I wrote a book called The Leader Secret Code with some co-authors, and there was a very simple mantra there, and it was, as you believe, so you behave, and as
Mm.
you behave, so you perform. So on many occasions, I work with leaders, and we talk a lot about behaviors, but you'll hear me use this phrase a lot. We've got to go backwards to go forwards. We've got
Right.
to go and have a look at the mindsets of leaders, the
Right.
mindsets of people, because that will lead to then the behaviors. And if we then really look at the behaviors, then we'll start to see what kind of performance you get individually and collectively. So that's a kind of a roundabout way answer of some of the things that I picked up: emotions, behaviors, and mindsets. And I was insatiably curious. So why did I go through all of these transitions? I think it's because I was always keen to take opportunity whenever it knocked. So
Right.
when there was a chance to go from barrister to police officer, I took it. When there
Right.
was a chance to go from police officer back to barrister and prosecuting, I took it. When there was a chance to go into leadership development and learn, I took it. To write, I took it. The podcast was another story altogether. But
Right.
I think there was that insatiable curiosity, which is now playing out in what I do here as
Right.
part of the enigma, and in having the great opportunity to talk to you and to
Right.
share some thoughts with you. I'm just curious. So I always say I'm not really the person with all the answers. So I don't want to disappoint your listeners or your watchers, but I might be the chap that asks the frustrating or the annoying questions, which might prompt a leader to go away
Mhm.
and think about the very answer to those difficult questions. So I hope that's a bit of an answer for
No,
you,
I
for an
think
eclectic background.
it's really brilliant, Adam. So some of the things that I'm really taking away from this,
Yeah.
right? One is leaders don't need to have all the answers, and you just alluded to that. And I think we are going through such a scenario in the operating world,
Yep.
in organizations. It's okay for leaders to not have all the answers, and just be vulnerable about, and I think you use that word as well in the rapid fire
Yep.
section. It's just show your vulnerability, and just be there in your genuine self, supporting your team and supporting your people. I think the other big thing that you spoke about is curiosity, just having that growth mindset, just being
Hmm.
curious to embrace new opportunities and learn new opportunities, and keep moving forward and sharing that with the rest of the world in any way possible. So
Yeah.
love the responses, Adam. Thank you so much for shining some light on that. And I think the three things that you spoke about, emotions, behaviors, and mindsets, are absolutely critical for leaders to imbibe basis the context in which they are working.
Yeah.
Right? I think there's no one set behavior or one set mindset that's going to help them in their success in all contexts, right?
I think there's a couple of things that come out of this. I would just ask that any leader listening or watching this, please use 3 words more than you probably do at the moment. And those 3 words are, I don't know.
Oh,
It
I
will
love
set
that.
you free. I
Yeah,
had here the 25-year serving chairman and CEO of WD-40, which is the iconic
right,
oil in a can, but it's
yeah,
really more about memories. And Gary flew over from the USA. He was sat in the very seat here only a few days ago.
right,
And actually, he said that was one of the most powerful things that he could say in any context, at any level, even before he was CEO. I
yeah,
don't know. And I
yeah,
think in the current climate, we may be able to take some comfort that no one has all the answers. It's
absolutely,
so chaotic. It's
absolutely,
so variable.
yeah,
It is so uncontrollable in many ways
yeah,
that actually there's a real power and a humility and a vulnerability to just being able to say to people, I don't know.
yeah,
And I'm not the smartest person. Gary would actually say as well, he said, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room.
yeah.
And I love that.
Or with the wrong people.
With the wrong people. So please, anyone who's leading any size business at the moment, there is real power to I
Yeah,
don't know. And to
yeah,
your point, I've come across a lot of leadership styles,
yeah,
some good, some not so good.
yeah,
But I think you've made a really valid point that a good leader will flex his or
yeah,
her style
yeah,
to meet the context. And I'll just give you one example.
yeah,
A lot of people now will talk about command and control is an inappropriate way or an outdated way of leading or operating.
right,
Well, yes. And it's also the most appropriate way when the stakes are incredibly high or life is at risk. And
absolutely.
good leaders will know how to flex that style to be appropriate and authentic
Yeah,
in the circumstances they find themselves in.
yeah, yeah,
So there is no one size fits all.
yeah,
And, we'll come back to the conversation because, there are many people that we might point to in the world who are not of the caliber that we might
right.
aspire to be, but they're still very, very successful. So,
Mhm.
what is that conundrum for leaders as well? Who are our role models and,
Yeah,
and why should they be our role
yeah.
models? But I'm sure we'll come on to that.
Yeah, absolutely. No, and the whole command and control kind of leadership style, a lot of folks may say that it doesn't come into being in a organizational setup, but we saw that come about during COVID,
Mm,
right? And so a lot of organizations that had those strong leaders with a strong vision coming in and guiding the organization really survived through that phase. So
correct. And any organization will have a set of values.
yeah, yeah,
And in many ways, the values are part and parcel of the way that you control the organization,
yeah,
the guardrails that you put in place. It was once described to me as those are the riverbanks that will help the
yeah,
river flow from the mountains to the ocean. It will keep it on course.
right,
So, there are many ways that a leader or a leadership team will help an organization navigate through difficult times, not just
yeah,
through command and control, but
yeah,
also having strong values as well. I think
yeah.
that's also part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. So just looking back at some of the work that you've done with
Yep.
leaders in these iconic organizations like Google, Microsoft, HSBC, and the varied organization like the International Criminal Court and the police force.
Yes.
You spoke about values and you spoke about leadership styles. Can you talk a little bit about how they were differentiating and why they were differentiating in some of these organizations? And how did leaders build themselves in these organizations given the guardrails that you were talking about?
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot to that question, but let me kind of start with one of the things that I've been passionate to try and understand is what makes a great leader.
Yeah.
In any context, whether that's law enforcement, where I spent the majority of my life, whether it's professional services, whether it's iconic brands, whether it's disruptive startups, leadership is still incredibly relevant. And so one of the things that the podcast was all about was to try and uncover what is it about those leaders who are succeeding in any context, in any region, in any sector. So you'll hear me say a lot that I think that human-centered leadership is the superpower of today. Human-centered leadership.
Yeah.
And actually, we identified 8 components of human-centered leadership, and I'll just tell you what those are.
Yeah.
And we've touched on some of them already.
Yeah.
Now, this is no gospel. This is just a point of view from having done a huge amount of research, to having spoken to over 220 global leaders now, and something kept identifying itself.
Right.
And I didn't even realize that I was landing on this until I was at the book launch, and this is pre-pandemic, and there was about 120 people there, and someone in the audience says, "Right, Adam, I've got a question for you."
Yeah.
And nothing was pre-prepared, and they said, "What's the greatest learning that you have taken away from all the research and the writing of the book?" And for a millisecond, I thought, I have no idea. But the next millisecond, the answer just popped out. And it's funny because it's actually on camera, and I found the footage not long ago. And I actually said, it's human-centered leadership. And once I'd said that out loud to 120 people, I went away and I thought, where did that come from? And what did I really mean? So I started to unpack that.
Right.
So we've identified 8 components of human-centered leadership. And those are vulnerability, inclusivity, humility, empathy, personal purpose, presence, care, and curiosity. Now, there's not any rocket science in that, but what I'm now saying to many, many senior leaders is you have spent a lifetime with your qualifications and your expertise and your excellence in your field. You have become best in class. And with the advent of AI especially, those skills and capabilities have become table stakes.
Right.
Now, I'm not dismissing all the hard work people have put in. It took me a long time to qualify as a competent and confident lawyer. But let's be honest, with the digital transformation that we're seeing right now, much of that is becoming table stakes.
Right.
So something else is rising to the surface as the differentiator. And I'm suggesting it's human-centered leadership. So that was the DNA that I was seeing, regardless of where I was looking, as to what was holding great leaders out as great leaders.
Right.
But again, to your point, it's a little bit like if I go into the studio main room, they've got those graphic equalizers, those slider decks. What I'm saying is that leaders are constantly manipulating those sliders and changing their style in order to be appropriate in the ever-changing context they find themselves in. So I'm giving you a very difficult answer, really, aren't I? Because there's no cookie cutter anymore. I think leadership, research many, many decades ago would say it's this, or it's this, or it's this. Today, it's just not. It's an amalgam of things. We're constantly on the lookout for what it might be. We're constantly flexing, constantly experimenting. And by the way, constantly getting it wrong. But that's okay.
Being okay with that. Yeah.
So that's what I'm seeing. I'm suggesting the differentiator is the human-centered leader.
Right.
But it's also a leader who's comfortable to flex and style and experiment in order to be appropriate in the circumstances and context they find themselves in. I'll pause there.
Lovely points, Adam. Would you say then that the underlying requirement to be a good leader would also be agility? The ability to understand the scenario and then flex yourself. And so you're not, like you said, it's no longer a cookie cutter, development, right? It's no longer, there's no recipe book to good leadership anymore, right?
No,
So
I think, forgive me. I think you're right. And again, only last week I had Tiger Rajan, who was the former CEO of Genpact for 13 years. He was also sat in the studio. It's amazing the people that come and visit me. And we were talking about that. And he was talking about the need for himself, his team, his people to be agile. And we hear that term a lot.
Right.
But what was also important is we talked about the absolute essential ability of an organization to have a good set of listening systems, not
Mm.
just internally, but
Nice.
externally. What were the antennas
Right.
out into the world?
Right.
Because you've got to pick up on the weak signals. You've got to change that noise to some form of signal. And if
Right.
you're not listening, what are you trying to be agile to achieve?
Right.
So I liked that description that he came up with. Yes, the agility, but also what are the listening systems
Right.
in order to, what are you being agile for? What are you trying to achieve? How
Yeah.
are you going to be that trusted business partner to your
Yeah.
clients or your
Yeah.
customers?
And do these listening systems also feed into the strategy and the hard aspects of leadership development? And the reason I'm asking about this, Adam, is this whole geopolitical situation that we are in, right? With the wars happening and the tariffs coming in and the political situation. I mean, I think uh, 10 to 12 countries recently elected new governments around the world, and
Yes.
those governments are still shaping up various policies that's going to impact your supply chain. It's going to impact talent. It's going to impact taxation, etc. Right? So, is it also about having cues on how the world is shifting around you, and then how do you re-strategize, reprioritize, and then take the organization forward?
Again, you're absolutely right. We talk to leaders a lot about the ability to do two things at the same time.
Yeah.
One is exploit high performance day to day
Yeah.
so that you maintain a sustainable business.
Yeah.
But the second one is how do you also explore far into the distance in relation to the possible opportunity and challenges that may be coming for you and your client base. And you've got to be able to, as a senior leader, to do that simultaneously.
Right.
Because when I talk to so many CEOs, there's a word that they fear, and that word is irrelevant. They do not want to become irrelevant, and that can
Yeah.
happen very quickly. And we've seen this.
We've seen that. Yeah.
And I've had disruptors in the studio who are disrupting
Right.
mainstream, traditional, and iconic businesses.
Yeah. Yeah.
And they're going to be the next unicorn in the system, or they're going to be the next number one.
Yeah.
So again, when I spoke to Tiger, I said to Tiger, as the CEO, what was your balance of being internally focused,
Right.
130,000 people,
Right.
and externally focused? And he said he would make sure he was 50-50.
Mm.
He wanted to feed his curiosity by being externally focused, but he also had to be externally focused, to your point, to make sure that they were listening, they
Right.
were picking up on the weak signals, they were translating that into vision, they were changing their strategy as necessary,
Right.
and or he was changing his mind. He may have come to a decision which
Yeah.
fundamentally was flawed, was wrong, and
Right.
he needed to pivot. And that's where the humility comes back into a leader who says, I thought it was this,
Right.
I was wrong. It's
Yeah.
now this. We're making a 180-degree turn.
Yeah.
And so it's a requirement almost of leaders now to understand that no one has all the answers.
Yeah.
You're never going to get this right.
Yeah.
The world is shifting at a rate that we've never seen before. So let's be honest, today is as simple as it gets.
Yeah.
And there are many things, and you mentioned a number of them, that are completely outside of our control.
Yeah.
So control the controllables,
Yeah.
but try and have the skills and capabilities within your people so
Yeah.
that you are fast decision making. You can pivot. You've got the agility. You've got great listening systems and antennae all over the place,
Right.
and you will course correct as and when appropriate. I mean, I'm making it sound simple, aren't I? But we know it's not.
But I just love that thought. Today is as simple as it's going to get.
It really is. Tomorrow, I'm afraid, it's going to be more complicated. So
Yeah. Yeah.
we're having this
Enjoy.
conversation at just the right time.
Yeah. I love that. It's interesting. You spoke about the human-centered leadership, and
Yeah.
I think one of the things that it's done is it's given the CHRO a seat at the table, right?
Yes.
And I think that's something that was always a topic of discussion in the HR community and the learning and development community is how do you get a seat at the table? And I think with this focus that organizations have on a lot of the people-oriented skills that we spoke about, humility, vulnerability, CHRO comes into the picture.
Mhm.
Adam, can you talk a little bit about where does the CHRO role go from here today? Now, given this environment in which we are, there was a good position that the CHRO and the CLO had in terms of
Yep.
building internal capabilities, preparing organizations for crises like COVID, etc. We've come out of that. We're kind of going back into the old ways of working, and the new normal is not the new normal anymore.
The next normal.
The next normal, right? So where does the CHRO and the CLO go from here, and what can they be taking up as roles to further and reinforce what they're doing within organizations?
Yeah, this is a great point, and I am delighted that the CHRO, or the Chief People Officer, that he or she is now sat on the top table,
Yep.
because that is incredibly important. In fact, I think our CEO, Tom Monahan at Heidrick, has just written an article and commented on just the significance of the CHR role. And we're seeing that
Right.
in the work that we do. I'm going to oversimplify again, and I'm going to talk about and I don't like using the word asset, but the greatest asset in
Yeah.
most organizations are the people. And as far as I'm aware, we only employ one species. Well, certainly at the moment, that's humans.
Mm-hmm.
So it's about taking great care that 95% of your assets will walk out of the door at the end of the day. And then the question is, well, why should they come back?
Cool.
So it is really about the CHROs having that position at the top table, because if I oversimplify, as I said, any business today is at a certain point in time. So if I put a flag in the sand, any business you look at is at a point in time today. And every single business has a plan to go somewhere in 1 year, 3 years, 5
Yep.
years, or 10 years. They've got a plan.
They
So it's
better
a little bit like a broken satellite navigation system. Organizations need to clearly understand, where are we now?
Yep.
And where are we going? What are the coordinates?
Yep.
And then I think really the CHRO and the CPO, this is about trying to understand, what are the skills and capabilities that your people require? What do
Mm-hmm.
they need to know, do, or believe differently in order for that destination
Yep.
to become a reality?
Yep.
That, I think, is where this sits.
Yeah.
And they've also got to course correct, because if you think about skills, AI is just churning out skill. We can't keep up. So
Absolutely.
what are the critical skills,
Right.
the critical emotions, behaviors, and mindsets that will allow an organization to be successful in an
Right.
utterly changing and utterly chaotic environment?
Right.
So I think you have to have the CHRO with you on the journey, because you're going to be pivoting and course correcting and reassessing
Right.
all the time.
Yep.
The days of putting out a strategy and saying, we'll revisit that in a year and it's good, well, they're long gone, aren't they? As soon as you create the strategy and it hits the fresh air, it's probably out of date.
Yeah.
So
Absolutely.
it is that flexibility to say, we know where we are, we know where we're going,
Right.
and we're going to be course correcting almost like a rocket all the time
Yeah.
in order to achieve our goal, or achieve our destination, or achieve a variation of that destination, because the world shifted.
Yeah. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Absolutely, Adam. And I think it brings us to this concept of change.
Yeah.
Right? And how do you adapt to change, and how do you manage change? How do you lead change?
Yeah.
And I think it's the most cliched statement that change is the biggest constant, right? But it is true, especially in today's day and age. I mean, you're changing every day with
Yeah.
technology, with talent, with priorities, with policies. So, in the work that you've done with leaders in corporates, and then with the police force and the International Criminal Court, how do you advise leaders to build two things? One, resilience, because that's needed when you're going through this much amount of change and chaos. So, one, how do you build resilience? And two is, um, how do you manage change? And how do you help your teams manage change?
Yeah. Those are big questions, aren't they?
You could get to this year, Adam.
I'm gonna deal with the first part. You mentioned resilience,
Yeah.
and many ways of describing resilience, but it is that ability to bounce back from some form of adversity. And I remember the research that we did for the book, The Leader's Secret Code. We had
Mhm.
must have been over 150,000 data points, and we identified the 7 core beliefs of
Yeah.
the top performing leaders through that research. And someone far wiser than me crunched that data. One of the 7, probably no surprise, was resilience.
Mm.
A leader had to have a level of resilience in
Right.
order to be a top performing leader. Now, with that research, we also found out that there were 2 journey motivators to every belief. So when we talk about a belief is an emotionally held, deep-rooted opinion that we assume to be fact. And what that does is that then leads to a certain mindset and a certain set of behaviors. And we've all got deep-rooted beliefs.
Yeah.
But we also identified that there were always two paths or two journey motivators towards a belief. And
Mhm.
with resilience, it was work hard or work smart. And the whole premise of the book and the whole premise of looking at these particular beliefs was, what was the balance that leaders held? So it wasn't saying you always have to work hard or you always have to work smart. It was about leaders finding that balance. And
Right.
just in relation to resilience, we did things out of a 20-point scale. So you could either be 10, 10, 20, 0, 19, 1. And actually for resilience, we found that the top performing leaders were 4, 16. 4 was in relation to working hard and
Right.
16 was in relation to working smart. So we saw that those leaders understood the benefit and the power of being resilient, but
Right.
they also understood that they tended to favor the balance of working smart, not
Mhm.
just working hard. So when the going gets tough, the tough get going.
Yep.
Yes, but that's not sustainable, and we've seen burnouts and all kinds of issues
Right.
from a human being perspective. So resilient, incredibly important, one of the 7 core beliefs, but it's really more about working smart and working through others as it is of just head down and pushing through something. And to
Interesting.
your point, I think we saw a lot of that from people who were successful during COVID,
Right.
where we
Right.
come back to it and you had some CEOs who said, never seen this before, I'm not really sure how we're going to navigate this.
Right.
Best idea wins. How will we get through this? How will we be smart now in relation to going through this? And also, how will we work hard in order to get through this? So it's about that. It's about that balance. So that's what I'd say in relation to resilience. Forgive me, the second part of your question, remind me.
It was about change, Adam. So just given the amount of change that organizations are going through,
Yeah.
how can leaders manage change and lead change for their teams?
Right. So this is an interesting one. I'm a parent. My
Right.
kids are teenagers now, but I always love the phrase that parents might say to their kids, which is "do as I say, not as I do." It never works, and that doesn't work for leaders either.
Right.
So
Right.
there's a couple of things that are on my mind. One is the role of the role model.
Mm.
So if you really want to inspire change, then you've got to role model the
Mhm.
behaviors or
Right.
role model the change, because as a leader, you are always being watched. I hear that time and time again now from senior leaders. You are always being watched, and you're being watched and you're known by people who you have no clue who they are.
Mhm.
If
Yep.
you're the leader of 130,000 strong workforce, you don't know the vast majority of those people,
Yeah.
but they know you,
Yeah.
and
You're
they
right.
see you,
Yeah. And
and
they're
they hear
judging.
you,
Yep.
and they'll put 2 and 2 together and come up with 5.
Yeah.
So the power of the role of the role model is really important in relation to not only the role of the human-centered leader, but also in other people taking their cue
Right.
from you about how you're dealing with a certain situation or how positive you are on a certain situation or the behaviors that you want to be able to cascade through an organization. I
Right.
also think when we talk about change as well, something that's important, we spoke about this, is the power of values.
Mhm.
Strong values of an organization. They're your freedom in a frame. I
Right.
loved it. Gary actually, as I say, came in and he talked about values are both the glue
Right.
and the freedom.
Mm.
Now, I think this is important. When there are huge times of change, I talk to leaders and I talk about the freedom in the frame. I talk about, if you think of a football pitch, it's got the boundary lines. So
Right.
all of the players know when the ball is out,
Right.
and they
Right.
can only do what they do when the ball is in play.
Right.
And so I always say to leaders, and this doesn't really have to be about times of great change, although let's be honest, we are in times of great change. I say to leaders, do the people that you lead know the non-negotiables?
Mm. Mm.
Do you have you been explicit in relation to what the non-negotiables are, the behaviors that you require as part and parcel of this business?
Mm. Mm.
Do they really, really know when the ball is out of play? Because
Right.
when they do, those are the guardrails that give people the safety.
Right.
But then people on the pitch have all the trust, the autonomy, and the empowerment to
Right.
do what it is that you hired them to do in the first place.
Yeah.
So I think that
Yeah.
is really setting up your team to succeed, setting up
Yeah.
your team to do exactly what it is that you hired them to do,
Yeah.
regardless of the operating environment around them.
Yeah.
And I think without any guardrails, without any values, without any glue, I think we can all get lost.
Yeah. Yeah. Absolutely. And I love the it's glue and freedom. It provides you the stickiness and it provides you the freedom. And
Yeah.
I think I'll come back to values. I do have a question on values, but I want to go back to something that you said earlier, which is resilience. Can you talk to us a little bit about the balance between resilient leader and a vulnerable leader? How do they go hand in hand? Are there
Well,
conflicts? Are there challenges?
I think with all the conversations that we're having, we can talk about some of the core beliefs of top performing leaders, and we can talk about the components of human centered leadership.
Right,
Some of those will be natural to people,
right,
and some will be work in progress and forever work in progress. So you can only really head towards your natural style. You want to still be authentic in any given context. And so, we say to leaders, there's no real set pro forma for this. It's about you having the ability and having the safety to experiment and change your own style as you see appropriate. And sometimes leaders struggle with that because they think, well, hang on, if I'm the leader of this organization, I have to act in a certain way. I have to be
right,
the smartest
right,
person in the room. I have to have all the answers.
right.
And we know that it's a nonsense. It
Yeah,
really is.
yeah,
So then
absolutely.
it comes back to that ability to be vulnerable, to be very, very humble, to be utterly exclusive, and sometimes to be the person who says nothing. And
Yeah,
as an example, I say to a lot of leaders, if you're the most important person in the room, you're the most senior person in the room, you've called the meeting, I say, are you the first person to talk or the last? And I say to leaders, do me a favor. When you do it again next time, be the last person to speak and see what happens. See
yeah,
what happens to the dynamic.
yeah.
So with all of this, we are work in progress. And again, I know I keep referencing Gary because he was in the studio just a few days ago. When I said to him, how would you sum up your 25 years as chairman of and CEO of the happy billion-dollar company, which is WD-40, he
Right.
turned around to me and he said, that was my 25-year apprenticeship in leadership.
I love that.
Now I have to pay it forward.
Yeah,
That's the kind of humility
humility. Yeah,
that allowed somebody to be successful in a publicly listed company who's an Antipodean now working in the US.
absolutely.
And I think that's what this is all about. It's about leaders now trying to tap into that innate series of human-centered characteristics, because that's going to be the differentiator. And AI, unfortunately, will do the rest.
That's always there in the background, right? It's
Sure.
lurking somewhere. But I think what I'm taking away from this is um, being vulnerable is feeding into you being resilient as well. So it's not conflicting, but
It's a
it's
paradox.
yeah, yeah,
And leaders are going to have to navigate the gray area,
yeah,
navigate the paradox daily.
absolutely.
How do you be the strong leader and lead from the front
Right.
and get out of the way and be at the back?
Yeah,
There's just an example of a paradox.
yeah, absolutely.
And so it's about a leader with all of those saying, where am I on the scale
On the
at this
scale.
precise moment in time today within the context within I'm
Yeah,
operating?
yeah. And you as a leader, you've got to know where, going back to your whole GPS analogy, right? You've got to know where you need to be
Hmm.
in that context, in that scenario, and be able to flex that. Just want to go back to something you said about values. One of the role of a leader is also to help them understand values, help the larger organization understand values. And I feel the challenge with values is that there's no consistency in understanding the values across the workforce, right? So if I have 130,000 people in a company,
Hmm.
they have their own perceptions, their own experiences, their own definitions of values. What can a leader do to bring alignment among the workforce on values?
I'll tell you a story.
Yeah,
Love a story. I remember working with a global organization, and they had spent a gazillion dollars working out some fancy values. And those values, I think there were 6 or 7 at the time, which is quite a lot. And they were all over the walls and all over the screens and all over paperwork, and they were everywhere to see. And they'd been in existence for 18 months. And I remember going to this organization and saying to a number of the XCOMs, so tell me about the values. And most of them couldn't tell me what the values were. And then I walked around the corridors of HQ and I just said to people, so tell me a little bit about the values. And no one could really tell me much about the values or even remember them. And there lies the problem, is
yeah,
they were actually just the candy floss
yeah,
on the wall. It was a tick box. And I think one of the things that's incredibly important for every organization is, if the values are going to be the glue and the freedom,
Right.
How do you help everybody understand what the values are explicitly,
Right.
the behaviors that you require
Yeah.
explicitly,
Hmm.
and also give them an opportunity to understand how do they live the values day to day in the place within which they operate. If I'm on the factory floor, how do I live the values day to day?
Hmm.
If I'm out as a sales rep all over the world doing whatever how do I live the values day to day?
Hmm.
If I am the CEO at HQ and the ambassador of this organization, how do I live the values day to day?
Hmm.
So when we talk about values, and this is interesting, I think it's about thinking about those as the riverbanks.
Right.
They are your guide in relation to how you will operate, and certainly operate at times of great stress. You've got to go some way in helping people to explicitly understand what it is that you need
Right.
to live those values in a supportive way,
Right.
and also for people to understand what are the behaviors that would undermine those values.
Right. Right.
And then I
Absolutely.
think it's also important to give people within the organization an opportunity to think about, how do I live the values day to day? Now, the reason this is so important, because I say to every leader, we come back to the role of the role model now, is
Hmm.
if you haven't gone through some form of process to explicitly understand this, how can you hold yourself or others accountable for living the values in a positive way? How do you help the people that you lead understand how they live the values day to
Right.
day?
Right.
How do they stop becoming just words on a screen, words on a wall, words on a piece of paper,
Yeah. Yeah.
but they become something that is lived every single day? So you
Yeah.
can hear I'm passionate about this,
Yeah. Absolutely.
because the organizations that get this right,
Yeah.
to Gary's point,
Yeah.
use this as the glue,
Yeah.
and then allow people the freedom to do what it is that they do, that they were hired for, because they're amazing at it.
Yeah.
They don't need micromanaging.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And I think a lot of it also goes back to the human-centered leadership.
Yeah,
You provide the guardrails, and then you give that empowerment to your people. They're smart people. You've hired smart people. You let them be, and you let them excel at the role and the work that they are doing. Um, uh, we often speak about creating the psychological safe space, right? So that your talent is able to bring their authentic self to the
yeah,
workplace. And we spoke a little bit about this. You said leaders need to speak last, role model, values. These are all great ways of being able to create that psychological safe
yeah.
workplace. But given the extensive work that you've done, especially even on the police force, how do you what's your um, um, guidance to leaders on how to create a psychological safe environment?
This is so important, and obviously this is something that's spoken about a lot, and it's become heightened over the last several years. I remember originally when we think about, it was Project Aristotle, I think, that came out of Google, where they looked at
Yeah,
psychologically safe teams and what were the critical components there. And I remember one of them, and forgive me if I'm getting this wrong, was about this conversational turn taking. That it was that every single person
right,
has a voice,
right,
and that there's freedom and safety for every single person to have a voice. So I can only talk from a personal perspective. Whenever we're mobilizing as a team, it's incredibly important that there is psychological safety within that team,
right.
so that all voices are heard. Everyone feels belonging. Everyone feels valued.
Hmm.
Everyone feels that they have independence of choice.
Hmm.
And everyone feels without hesitation that they can go and give feedback to other people. Now, there's a little bit of a link here in relation to holding each other accountable for living the values and doing what it is that we would say that we would do. There's
Right,
nothing more powerful, is there, than somebody, perhaps more junior, coming up to you as a leader and actually saying, "Can I give you some feedback? Can I just talk to you about, you're doing that thing,
right.
and that thing actually isn't congruent with what you're asking us to do,
Has to do. Yeah,
or it's not actually in the spirit of the values." Now, for some, that might be a horrific thing for them to think about. But what a power for somebody
hmm,
to have the safety to actually say, "Adam, you're doing that thing, and that thing isn't consistent with the values that we live." And for me as a human being to say, "Do you know what? I'm having a bad day. And actually,
yeah,
thank you for pulling me up on that. And thank you for bringing that to my attention. And I need to do something about it."
yeah, yeah.
But you've got to work really, really hard in relation to having that kind of lived experience within a team where all feel very safe, in order to
Right,
have that kind of feedback loop. And it comes back down to accountability again as well. Is
Yeah.
are we clear on what is expected, not only from each and every one of us as an individual,
Right.
but us as a collective?
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a play of organizational culture here as well, Adam.
Yeah.
Is the organization creating a culture where the leader is also feeling safe and getting that feedback, and they don't feel threatened,
Yes.
and they know that they have a place, they have a space, and these feedback coming in from the team is only going to help them create the right environment for their teams to be able to be productive.
And the last thing I'd say in relation to this is some people might be saying, is this all a leader's responsibility?
Yeah.
And I would actually say, well, everybody in that organization is a leader, from the newest, shiniest intern
Yeah.
right through to the CEO. So I get lots of people on programs that we run, and events that we run, and some people might put their hand up and say, well, I'm an individual contributor. Is this relevant to me? I don't lead anyone. I don't manage anyone.
Yeah.
No one reports to me.
Right.
And I always say to people, this is very relevant to you.
Right.
And I'll tell you why, because I had one guest on, John Amici. He's been on a couple of times. And I asked lots and lots of people, well, hang on, what does leadership mean? Because we throw this term around all the time, and you hear it all, radio, TV, everywhere you go, leadership. Well, I was a little confused. What does this mean?
Right.
So here we go. You'll love this. I made the mistake of putting that into Google. What does leadership mean into Google? And I got 1,950,000,000 responses. Now, let's be honest, that's deeply unhelpful, isn't it? So I went on a little bit of a journey to try and work out, what does leadership mean? And I spoke to one guest, John Amici, who's a psychologist in the UK, former NBA player as well. So he's got an interesting background.
Right.
And he gave me a definition which resonated with me. And I'll just share it with you.
Yes, please.
He said, leadership is your promise of a lived experience for those around you. Now, I think that's really powerful, because it's you provide a lived experience for those around you, not necessarily those who report to you, but all of those people who interact with you. And let's be honest, we sell a bit of a dream, don't we, as organizations? You know, we're always trying to get the very best and the very brightest into our organization. And we say, look, here's our mission and our purpose and our values. And this is what it's going to be like for you when you join us. Well, if these great young talents come into an organization and the lived experience is categorically different to the promise that was made,
right,
they will leave. And we saw that in many organizations. So any person operating in an organization provides a lived experience for those people around them. Every single person is a leader. And I think that really resonated with me, you know, as regards its application. And I'll share one other anecdote, because it was something actually that someone picked up on and shared on LinkedIn, very kindly shared on LinkedIn, and it got lots of comments. Because a lot of people say to me, why are you so passionate and a little bit maniacal in relation to leadership? One is because this is an insatiably curious journey where I'll never really have all the answers, but I'll just keep asking questions. But I go back to my mentor, who was a larger-than-life Floridian trial lawyer who unfortunately passed away. And I remember very excitedly going to him when I got my first leadership role as a young lawyer. And he said something to me which I will never forget. And without a doubt, this is the fire that pushes me to do the work that I do. He said this, congratulations. And then he said, remember, the children of the people that you lead will know your name.
Wow.
In what context is up to you.
Wow.
And that's never left me. And the reason that I say that to all the audiences that I'm ever talking to is because leadership is actually deeply personal.
Yes.
And I think that's become even more magnified since the pandemic, because we lost the connection. We lost the human connection. So now people need to connect, reconnect, and stay connected more than ever. I feel I'm preaching now, so I'm going to stop there. But that's where the passion comes from.
I mean, that's just amazing. And I'm so glad that you brought that up. I'm just eager to hear about the comments that our listeners will have on that definition and on that anecdote that you just shared. What I really liked about that definition was that it had nothing to do with success or failure.
Nope.
It wasn't putting a leader on a pedestal. It was just about your lived experiences.
Yeah.
So I think that's going to stay with a lot of us. Thank you so much for sharing that, Adam. I know we can continue talking about this topic, well into the future. There's so much more for us to cover, feedback, there's AI and everything else. But I do want to ask you one last question,
Sure.
more as a guideline to our listeners. So if you take on the role of a CLO of a company and you are mandated to do leadership development, what would your guidance and advice be for somebody who's doing this, who's going to pick up leadership development for a large organization? What should they be focused on?
Well, I think at the heart, we're working on something at Hydrogen and Struggles called the connecting leader. And right at the heart of that particular model is a learning mindset.
Okay.
And I think that's why the role of the CLO, the CHRO, the CPO is just so important at the moment, because we need a learning mindset.
Yeah.
Because of how chaotic things are. We need a learning culture. And you saw this as well from Satya Nadella when he took over as CEO
Right.
of Microsoft. And the phrase that I love is, if you are a leader, you have to be forever a learner and forever a teacher.
Right. Right.
And I think that should and could be at the heart of the role of any CLO. That's how important it is. Every single person in that organization is forever a learner.
Right.
And forever a teacher.
Yep. Yep. I think just having that, separating that from all the other noise about ROI and everything else that we, burden the CLO about. I think it's just about how do you create a learning culture within the organization. I think everything else is going to take care by itself. Adam, thank you so much for joining us on today's edition. It was absolutely lovely chatting with you, and I'm sure that our listeners and viewers are taking away a few things that's going to help them change or make a change themselves or make a change in the organizations that they are part of. I can't thank you enough. And to our listeners and viewers, thank you for tuning in. Till next time, take care and wish you all the best. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much indeed for having me. I hope this was useful for all of your listeners and watchers. Hold me accountable. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.